The mud on her boots was still wet when she was handed the servant's entrance key and told not to use the front door. She had not expected them to say it so plainly. She had not expected much, in truth. Not warmth, not courtesy, not any acknowledgement that 3 weeks ago she had been the daughter of the house, and not the girl standing in the yard with a carpet bag and a borrowed coat 2 sizes too large. But she had not expected the housekeeper to hold out the key the way one holds out something disagreeable, between 2 fingers, as though the object itself required distance. Theodora Blackwell took the key. She had been rehearsing how to do this for 11 days. 11 days since her uncle's solicitor had come to Grey Hollow with the papers, and her cousin Piers had stood by the window looking at nothing in particular. And she had understood in the space of a single sentence that the house she had grown up in no longer belonged to her. Her father had died in October. The will that surfaced in November was not the one he had written. The one that surfaced named her uncle guardian of the estate until such time as a proper trustee could be appointed, and the trustee her uncle proposed was himself, and the solicitor who drafted the new will had worked for her uncle for 16 years. Theodora was 23 years old. She had no money of her own, no relations outside her uncle's household, and a small leather case of her mother's letters that she had taken from the desk before anyone thought to lock the study. She had also tucked into the case beside the letters a single document she had found 3 days after her father's death behind the false bottom of the escritoire in his dressing room. She did not fully understand what it was. It was a letter, or the draft of one, in her father's hand, addressed to the Duke of Aldenmoor. The date was the previous spring. The letter spoke of an arrangement, not in explicit terms, the way her father never spoke of anything in explicit terms, but of an old agreement between 2 families, and of a piece of land on the eastern edge of the Grey Hollow property that had once been promised, and of her father's concern that certain parties were already moving to dissolve what had been settled long ago. Aldenmoor. She had known the name her whole life without ever attaching it to a person. The Aldenmoor estate was 12 miles northeast of Grey Hollow, across the moor and through the valley, and the Duke who held it had inherited young and kept to himself and was discussed in the village the way distant weather is discussed, with general awareness and no real knowledge. She had written to him, carefully, briefly, from a posting inn 2 towns away, so the letter could not be traced. She had not told him who she was. She had written only that she was seeking a position in a house of good standing, that she had experience with correspondence and household accounts, and that she had been recommended by a connection she was not at liberty to name. She had signed the letter with her mother's maiden name, Marsh. The reply had come in 4 days. The position was that of under-secretary to the house steward. The wage was fair. She was to present herself at the servants' entrance on the 14th. She was here on the 14th. The housekeeper's name was Mrs. Clary, and she was a small woman with extraordinary posture and an expression that suggested she had formed her opinion of Theodora already and saw no reason to revise it. She led Theodora through a series of back corridors without speaking, past the kitchens where something smelled of onion and hot fat, past a laundry room where 2 girls glanced up and then away, and finally to a small room on the upper servants' floor that contained a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the stable yard, and nothing else. "Meals are in the servants' hall at 6:12 and 6:30, Mrs. Clary said. "You will begin with Mr. Hallam tomorrow morning at 8. His Grace does not require the domestic staff to present themselves to him personally, but he takes notice of things. I would recommend you do your work quietly." "Yes," Theodora said. "Miss Marsh." Mrs. Clary paused at the door. "We had a girl here last spring who thought a large house was a place to make inquiries. She lasted 3 weeks. She said it without particular malice. It sounded more like a note about the weather than a threat. "Good evening." Theodora put her carpetbag on the bed and sat beside it and looked at the window. She had thought during the 11 days of planning that the hardest part would be getting through the door. She had not anticipated that the hardest part would be sitting in a room that smelled of old wood and lavender water and feeling, for the first time since October, entirely still. There was no solicitor here, no cousin peers looking at windows, no one expecting her to behave as though the ground had not shifted beneath her feet. She put her hand on the carpetbag and felt the shape of the case inside it and let herself breathe. Mr. Hallam was a careful man. He ran the household accounts with the precision of someone who had learned very early that small errors become large ones, and he regarded Theodora's first morning of work with the expression of a person who has been given something he did not ask for and is not yet sure what to do with it. She copied correspondence. She organized invoices by date and then by vendor. She cross-referenced the ledger entries against the receipts in a way that Mr. Hallam had apparently been meaning to do for some months, but had not had the time for. And by the end of the first week, he had stopped watching her from across the room and had begun simply handing her things. She did not make inquiries. She listened. A large household is never quiet, not truly. It hums along its back passages with information the way a river moves along its bed, and Theodora had grown up in a house large enough to know how to stand in the current. She learned that the Duke's name was Lucian Aldenmoor, that he was 34, that he had come into the title at 21 when his father died, that his mother had died 4 years before that, and he had been sent away to school shortly afterward, that he had a reputation for fairness and a greater reputation for memory. That last part came from the cook, a woman named Bess, who had been at Aldenmoor for 19 years, and who spoke about the Duke with the particular mixture of loyalty and exasperation that comes from watching someone grow from a difficult boy into a complicated man. "He doesn't forget things," Bess said, one afternoon when Theodora was in the kitchen, copying out a provisioning order. "Not a slight, not a kindness. He keeps it all. I've seen him remember, 10 years on, the name of a man who cheated a tenant of his. Not that he acted on it straight away. Just remembered." "What did he do?" Theodora asked. She was trying to make the question sound idle. Bess glanced at her. "Eventually, the man needed something from the estate. Reference letter, I think it was, and His Grace simply said he couldn't in good conscience provide one. Gave his reasons, all very calm. But that man had been waiting 10 years not knowing it was coming." She turned back to the pot she was stirring. "I'd rather have someone shout at me and be done with it." Theodora thought about this on the walk back to the records room. She had been at Aldenmoor for 3 weeks when she found the portrait. It was not in a public room. She would have encountered it sooner, otherwise. It was in the library, which she had access to because Mr. Hallam had asked her to retrieve a series of ledgers from the lower shelves, and she had gone in the early evening when the light was still good, and she had looked up from the shelves and seen above the fireplace a portrait of a woman she recognized. She stood with a ledger in each hand and looked at the portrait for a long time. The woman in the portrait was perhaps 35. She wore a dress in the fashion of 25 years ago, pale green, with her dark hair arranged simply. She had a particular quality of attention in her expression, the way certain people look as though they are listening to something just out of frame. Theodora had seen that expression before on a smaller portrait, in a different house, and it was not the same woman. It was her mother's sister. Her mother's older sister had married a man named Harwick and moved north when Theodora was very young, and Theodora had only the vaguest memory of her. A smell of rose water, a low voice, a pair of hands that held a teacup in a way her own mother had always found characteristic and inexplicable. The aunt had died before Theodora was 10, and the subject had not been revisited, and Theodora had not thought of her in years. She was on the wall of Aldenmoor's library. Theodora replaced the ledgers she did not need and left with the ones she did, and she did not tell anyone what she had found. She went back the following evening, without the excuse of the ledgers, and looked at the portrait for longer. There was a small brass plate on the lower edge of the frame. It read, Lady Aldenmoor, 1871. Her aunt had married into this house. Her aunt had been the previous Duke's wife, which meant that Lucian Aldenmoor, the man who had given her a position under a false name, was the son of her mother's older sister. He was her cousin. She sat down on the library floor, which she would not have done had there been any risk of being seen. And she pressed her back against the bookshelf and looked at the ceiling and worked through the arithmetic of it. Her mother had died when Theodora was 15. She had not known, or had not said, or perhaps had said things that Theodora had been too young to understand. Her father had known. The letter to the current Duke was evidence of that. He had been in correspondence with Lucian Aldenmoor about an old arrangement, about land on the eastern edge of Grey Hollow, and he had been concerned about parties moving to dissolve what had been settled. Her uncle, he had been moving even then, and her father had known it, and had written to Aldenmoor seeking. What, exactly? Witness? Confirmation? Some older form of protection that Theodora could not yet name? She got up off the floor and smoothed her skirt and walked back to the upper servants' floor and lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling for most of the night. She met the Duke on a Tuesday. It was not arranged. She had not been preparing herself, which was the particular indignity of it. She had been carrying a box of correspondence from the records room to Mr. Hallam's office and had taken the back corridor past the boot room and had come around the corner too quickly and walked into someone coming the other direction. The box did not fall. She caught it, or he caught her arm, or both things happened more or less simultaneously, and then she was standing in the corridor, holding the box, and looking at a man she had not yet seen in 3.5 weeks of employment. He was taller than she had constructed him in her imagination. She was not sure why that surprised her. He had dark eyes and a quality of stillness that she recognized from Bess's description, the stillness of someone who has trained himself out of impulsive reaction. He was looking at the box first and then at her, and his expression shifted in a way she could not categorize. Miss Marsh, he said. She hadn't expected him to know her name. Your Grace, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than the situation strictly required. Mr. Hallam speaks well of your work. He's been very patient in explaining the system, she said. She was thinking about the portrait. She was thinking about how to look at someone who was possibly her cousin without looking as though she knew he was possibly her cousin. Where are you from, Miss Marsh? He asked. It sounded like a question he was asking while thinking about a different question. Westerly, she said, which was the name of the village 2 miles from the posting inn, and not technically a lie if one did not examine it too closely. He looked at her once more, a particular kind of look, the kind that takes inventory, and then said, Good evening, and continued down the corridor. Theodora stood for a moment after he had gone. She had grown up watching her father negotiate things. He had been a careful man and a deliberate one, and he had taught her, without meaning to, how to read the room after an agreement has been made and before anyone has spoken its terms aloud. The corridor felt, after the Duke had left it, like that particular in-between moment. She was not sure what had just been agreed. She found the trunk 2 weeks later. She had not been looking for it. Mr. Hallam had asked her to catalog the items in the East Wing storage rooms, which had not been properly organized since the late Duke's death, and she had been working through the rooms systematically for 3 days. When she reached the 3rd room and saw, behind a wardrobe and 2 rolled carpets, a traveling trunk she recognized. It was her mother's. Not similar to her mother's, Not the same style or vintage. Her mother's, the dark green leather, the brass fittings shaped like small oak leaves, the long scratch on the lower right corner where it had caught on a gate latch. The summer Theodora was 8, and she had watched her mother smooth her thumb over the scratch with an expression that was not distress but something older and more familiar. She did not open it immediately. She stood in the room with her clipboard and her catalog sheets, and she waited until her hands had stopped wanting to shake, and then she opened it. The trunk contained letters, dozens of them, bundled in ribbon by year going back 30 years. She lifted the topmost bundle. The handwriting on the envelopes was her mother's. She sat on the floor of the storage room and read for an hour before she understood what she was reading. The letters were to Lady Aldenmoor, to her aunt, the woman in the portrait. They were the ordinary letters of sisters, and then the less ordinary letters of sisters in difficult circumstances, and then, near the end of the bundle from 12 years ago, something else. Her mother writing about a conversation with Theodora's father, and about a piece of land, and about an arrangement that had been made before Theodora's parents were married. An arrangement between the Blackwell family and the Aldenmoor family that was meant to protect certain interests of the younger sister in the event that the elder died. The elder had died. The arrangement had apparently not been enacted. Theodora replaced the letters in the order she had found them, closed the trunk, and spent the rest of the afternoon completing the catalog. She wrote down, 1 traveling trunk, leather, contents, personal correspondence, est, 30 years, and she filed the sheet with the others. That evening, the Duke sent word through Mr. Hallam that he wished to speak with her. The study was not what she had expected. She had built it in her imagination as a formal room, heavy furniture, the accumulated weight of a title. Instead, it was the room of a person who worked in it, with stacks of correspondence that were not disordered but were in active use, a desk that was oriented toward the window rather than toward the door, books that had been read rather than displayed. There was a fire, low, and the room smelled of wood smoke and paper. The Duke was standing when she came in. He gestured to the chair across from the desk and remained standing himself, which she noted. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I would like to ask you something directly, and I would prefer a direct answer." "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "What is your full name?" She had been prepared for many things in this room. She had not been prepared, she found, for the question to be this simple. She looked at him. He looked back with that quality of stillness, and she thought of Bess, saying he keeps it all, and she thought of her father's letter, and she thought of her mother's trunk in the east wing, with the oak leaf fittings and the scratch on the corner, and she thought that she was very tired. "Theodora Blackwell," she said. Something moved across his face, not surprise. She understood after a moment that it was the expression of a person confirming something they had already suspected. "Your father," he said, "wrote to me in April of last year." "I know," she said. "I found the draft." He was quiet. Then, "He wrote about the land agreement. He wrote about your uncle." A pause. "He wrote that he was concerned his health was failing and that certain arrangements might not survive him." "They didn't," Theodora said. He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than she knew what to do with. Then he said, "How long have you been in this house?" 7 weeks, she said. "And you found the portrait?" It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "And the trunk?" "Yes." He turned toward the window. Outside, somewhere in the stable yard, a horse shifted in its stall, and the sound came through distantly. And the fire settled, and Theodora watched the back of someone who was, apparently, her cousin work through something she could not see. "There is a document," he said finally, still facing the window. "My solicitor has had it for 6 months, since I began making inquiries after receiving your father's letter. Or rather, since receiving the letter your father sent. He was not well enough to sign it himself by the time it arrived. Someone signed it on his behalf. He paused. The signature was your uncle's. Theodora said nothing. The document your uncle signed, the Duke continued, turning back, was not the letter your father wrote. Your uncle's solicitor, it appears, understands how to replace a page within a correspondence and maintain the seal. He looked at her steadily. I did not know, when his letter arrived, that anything was wrong with it. It was only when I began making inquiries about the land agreement that I discovered the original letter your father wrote had contained a request that I act as a secondary trustee of the Grey Hollow estate. The fire shifted. A log settled. He asked you, Theodora said slowly. He asked me. Your uncle removed that page and submitted the remainder with a forged signature. He paused. I have had a solicitor working on this matter for 4 months. I did not know where you were. I had written to Grey Hollow and received a reply from your uncle's household to the effect that you were in good health and had made arrangements for your future independently. Theodora thought of Piers by the window, looking at nothing. I wrote that letter, she said. Or, I didn't, but I know who did. Your cousin, the Duke said. Yes. He crossed to the desk and sat, and for a moment he just looked at the surface of it, at the stacks of correspondence and the open ledger and the things that were the work of the day. Then he looked up at her. Miss Blackwell, he said. It was the first time he had used her real name to address her, and it landed differently than she had expected. Not like a formality, but like a door opening. I would like to tell you what I have been able to establish, and then I would like to ask your permission to proceed with certain actions on your behalf, the first of which will require you to remain at Aldenmoor for the time being, not as a member of the domestic staff. She looked at him. You are my mother's niece, he said simply. Whatever arrangement existed between our families aside, you are her niece, and you have been living in my house under a false name because no one acted when they should have. He did not say it with anger. He said it the way Bess had described him. Calm, precise, with the quality of someone who has been keeping an account. I am not yet certain what your uncle will do when he understands the situation. He is not, I think, a man who responds well to things he has not anticipated. No, Theodora said. Then I would prefer to anticipate him. A pause. Will you stay? She had been holding herself very carefully since she sat down in this chair, the way she had learned to hold herself in the 11 days between the solicitor's visit, and the morning she arrived at the servants' entrance. It was a kind of stillness that was not peace, but was the shape of it. The outline you maintain when the interior has not yet settled, she said. Yes. She did not move out of the upper servants' floor immediately. It seemed important, for reasons she could not fully articulate, to stay in the room she knew before she moved to one she didn't. The Duke did not press the matter. He asked Mrs. Clary to extend certain courtesies. She was invited to dine in the smaller dining room rather than the servants' hall. She was no longer required to report to Mr. Hallam, but he did not otherwise alter the visible structure of things, and she understood, without it being said, that this was deliberate. He was being careful. So was she. They had 3 conversations in the week that followed, all in the study, all in the evening. He told her what his solicitor had found. She told him what she had found. The draft letter, the sequence of events after her father's death, the things she had observed in the 11 days before she left Grey Hollow. He listened in the way she had come to understand was characteristic of him, without interrupting, without visibly reacting, cataloging. On the 4th evening he said, "Your uncle's solicitor has agreed to provide a statement." Theodora looked up. Men of that profession, the Duke said, are occasionally willing to correct certain errors when the correction is made more attractive to them than the alternative. He paused. My solicitor can be persuasive. What does the statement say? That the will he filed in November was not the will your father drafted. that he witnessed the original and can describe its contents. Another pause, that your uncle was aware the original will named you sole heir. She had known this. She had known it since the afternoon with the solicitor in the hall, since she had watched Piers look at the window and understood that he already knew the shape of what was coming. She had known it, and she had not let herself fully know it. The way you sometimes don't touch the thing that will hurt because touching it makes it permanent. She pressed her hands flat on the arms of the chair. "What happens now?" she said. "Your solicitor, or rather, the solicitor I am engaging on your behalf, will file a challenge to the will on the grounds of fraud. The process will take some months. Your uncle will be informed that his management of the Grey Hollow estate is under review." He looked at her. "He will know when that letter arrives that someone has been making inquiries. He will begin trying to understand who." "He'll suspect me," Theodora said. "Eventually," the Duke said, "by which time it will not matter that he suspects you." She looked at him. He looked back, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen there before. Not exactly warmth, but its precondition. The quality of a person who has decided something. "You said you kept this from me," she said, "about the inquiry." "For 4 months. I did not know you were here," he said. "I knew a Miss Marsh was here who worked for Mr. Hallam, and who Mr. Hallam spoke well of. I began to suspect something else when I passed you in the corridor." "What gave it away?" He was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to hold a box the way you held it," he said, "both hands underneath. She said it was the only way to carry something without worrying about dropping it." Theodora thought of her aunt, the woman in the portrait, the woman she could only barely remember. She thought of her mother writing letters to that woman for 30 years, bundled in ribbon by year, kept in a trunk in a storage room of a house where her daughter had come to work under a false name. "She knew my mother well," Theodora said. "It came out more quietly than she intended. They wrote every month," the Duke said. "After my mother died, I found all the letters. I read them." A pause that was slightly different from his other pauses. Shorter, not the pause of someone thinking, but of someone having to choose. "I knew your mother's name. I knew she had a daughter. I didn't know what had become of either of you after she died." Theodora said nothing. "I should have made inquiries sooner," he said. "When your father's letter arrived, the real one, the one I didn't receive, I should have acted on the absence of a reply." He looked at the desk. "I'm telling you this because I think you should know it. Not as an apology, as an account." She understood what he meant. He was not asking her to forgive the delay. He was telling her the record of it, accurately, the way he kept all records. "I know," she said. The letter from her uncle arrived at Aldenmoor 6 weeks later. It was addressed to the Duke and written in the careful, even hand of a man who has composed himself before composing his correspondence. He wrote that he understood his niece had come to be employed in the Duke's household under some misapprehension, and that as her legal guardian he wished to arrange for her return to Grey Hollow, and that he trusted the Duke would understand the concern of a family for a young woman who had acted perhaps hastily in a difficult period of grief. The Duke read the letter in the study. He read it twice. Then he set it on the desk and looked at it for a moment in the way Bess had described. He wrote back the same afternoon. Theodora did not read the reply, but she heard from Mrs. Clary, who had, Theodora had come to understand, a comprehensive awareness of everything that passed through the house, that it was a short letter. 3 paragraphs. Her uncle did not write again. The legal process took 9 months in total, which was faster than the Duke's solicitor had projected, and slower than Theodora had hoped. There were mornings during those months when she sat in the library, with the particular portrait above the fireplace, and felt the weight of the waiting in a way that was difficult to describe. It was not grief, exactly, though it was in the same neighborhood. It was the feeling of being held in suspension just before something resolves. she took to working in the library during those mornings. The Duke, who also had a habit of working in the library, did not comment on her presence. They worked at separate tables, mostly in silence, and occasionally one of them would say something about what they were reading, and the other would respond. And on certain mornings, it was less like two people working in the same room and more like two people who had gotten used to the same silence and found it comfortable. In February, his solicitor arrived with documents. In March, the judge's decision was filed. In April, Theodora Blackwell returned to Grey Hollow for the first time since November of the previous year, not as a servant, and not as a ward, and not as someone arriving at the back entrance with a carpet bag and a coat that didn't fit. She arrived in the Duke's carriage, which she had said was unnecessary, and which he had said was not a matter of necessity. The house was exactly as she remembered it and entirely different, the way things are when you have spent a long time away from them. And the long time has changed you, more than the distance changed them. She stood in the entrance hall and looked at the staircase and the light coming through the upper window, and the floor where she had stood 11 months ago, listening to a solicitor tell her what she no longer had. The Duke had come in behind her. He stopped at a slight distance, which was characteristic. "Well," he said. She turned around. He was looking at the entrance hall with the inventory expression, the one she had learned to read as I am putting this. "Somewhere I will not lose it." "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "Not for today," she said. "For all of it, all the months of it." She paused. "I know you don't require thanks. I know you would say it was simply what needed to be done." "It was," he said. "I know." She looked at him. "I'm saying it anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the carriage driver was leading the horses around to the stable yard, and the sound of hooves on gravel came through the walls, ordinary and real. "My mother would have wanted someone to act sooner," he said at last. "She would have been very—" He paused, and the pause was not the cataloging kind, but the other kind, the one she had learned to recognize. "She would have wanted someone to look after you." Theodora thought of the portrait above the fireplace. The woman in the pale green dress with the quality of attention in her expression, listening to something just out of frame. "She did," Theodora said. "In the end, she did." She watched him understand what she meant, not immediately, but in the way he understood things. Accumulating and then certain. His mother had kept the trunk. His mother had kept the letters. His mother had been gone for 17 years, and the evidence of her care had been sitting in a storage room of her son's house, waiting for the right person to find it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I should like, if you are willing, to be considered family." It was said very simply. It was the most careful sentence she had heard him speak. She had not cried once in 11 months. Not in the solicitor's hall, not on the road to the posting inn, not in the narrow room above the stable yard, not in the storage room, with her hands on the trunk, with the oak leaf fittings and the scratch on the corner. She found, standing in the entrance hall of Grey Hollow with the April light coming through the upper window, that this was the thing that did it. "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much." He nodded. "Once, in the way of someone filing something where it will not be lost or forgotten or quietly replaced." Outside, the horses settled. The house held them both.